And with that brief technical overview, I'll now introduce our speakers. Tonight, you'll hear from Hannah Matthews, the Director of Policy, Planning, and Research in the Division of Early Learning at OSSE, as well as Sarah Mead, the Deputy Superintendent for Early Learning at OSSE. Before handing things over to Hannah and Sarah, I'll walk through our agenda. We will start out tonight's session with an overview of the provider agreements for fiscal year 2024 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Then we'll highlight the fiscal year 2024 waiver process. And then we'll have time for Q&A before closing out. With all of that, I will now pass things over to Hannah.
Great, thank you so much, Julia, and hello to everyone who's joining us this evening. As Julia said, we're going to begin with an overview of the provider agreements for the fiscal year 24 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. I just want to remind you to please submit questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Next slide, please. As you know, in fiscal year 2024, OSSE will shift to distributing pay equity funds directly to child development facilities to increase compensation for early educators through what we call a Child Development Facility, or CDF, payroll funding formula. Early childhood educators will no longer receive direct payments through AidKit. To receive funds from the CDF payroll funding formula, child development facilities must be licensed by OSSE and agree to pay eligible early childhood educators by position and degree salaries that meet or exceed the minimum salaries that OSSE has established for fiscal year 24. And we're going to talk more about those minimum salaries later. Tonight, as we talk about the provider agreements, I want to let you know that the opt-in process for a child development facility to participate depends on whether or not a facility participates in the child care subsidy program. Non-subsidy providers who do not participate in the subsidy program must complete the fiscal year 24 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund provider agreement. Subsidy providers must complete the fiscal year 24 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund addendum to their subsidy agreement. The provider agreement and the subsidy addendum include the same requirements for participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. It is just the process that is different. So on tonight's session, we'll be going over the requirements that will apply to all providers. Some of these requirements will be familiar to subsidy providers, and some will be new for all providers. All providers must comply with all of the terms of the agreement or the addendum. OSSE cannot modify the terms of the agreement for individual child development facilities. Now, on this slide, you can see the deadlines for opting into the program and completing a provider agreement for each quarter. To receive the first quarterly payment, facilities must complete the opt-in process by 5 p.m. on September 15th. That is this Friday. And they must have an agreement executed by 5 p.m. on September 30th. Facilities should be mindful of these quarterly opt-in application and agreement deadlines in the chart should they wish to participate in the program. Providers who opt in by the Q1 deadline will need to ensure their staffing information is up to date in DELT by October 31st. And we're going to talk more about why that's really important. Remember that a child development facility only needs to apply once and complete one agreement for fiscal year 24. Once a facility has an agreement or an addendum executed, they will automatically receive the remaining quarterly CDF payroll funding formula awards, as long as they continue to meet the requirements of the program. Providers that are newly entering into agreements will receive payments on the next quarterly cycle following approval of the provider agreement. So if you should not have an agreement in place by September 30th, you could make the next deadline of December 31st. And of course, we hope that facilities will all participate in the full year of the program. So you can see on this slide all of the topics that are covered in the provider agreement. I'm not going to read through this slide, but I will let you know that we have quite a bit of content to cover tonight. We're going to discuss all of these topics to make sure that everyone is aware of what is included in the agreements. Next slide, please. So the very first section of the provider agreement describes the CDF payroll funding formula and how it's calculated. We have recently made some changes to the formula. The formula now has 4 components, which we will explain and talk through: the base award, the administrative enhancement, the equity adjustment that has been increased. I'll talk more about that. And we are including a fiscal year 24 supplement, which I'll explain. In fiscal year 24, the payroll funding formula awards will be calculated and distributed once per quarter. So each quarter, the formula will be run and a facility will receive the total award divided by 4. Now, as I mentioned, just last week, OSSI announced that it would increase CDF payroll funding formula award payments for fiscal year 24. Participating facilities that receive an equity adjustment will now get up to 60% of the base award rather than 40%. I'll talk more about that. And there's this fiscal year 24 supplement. For examples on how to calculate the payroll funding formula, we encourage you to check out the CDF payroll funding formula guide, and we'll drop a link to that resource in the chat. Now, I'm going to talk through a bit how to understand the calculation from the formula. So first, let's talk about the base award calculation. The base award is calculated by multiplying the number of teachers in a facility based on role and credential or degree by the corresponding wage supplement and summing the total. Now I'll explain the wage supplement in a few slides. The number of teachers and their credential levels are based on staffing data reported by a facility in the Division of Early Learning Licensing Tool, or DELT. So you can see here a graphic representation of the base award calculation. You would essentially be looking at the number of each teachers in each role, multiplying by the wage supplement and summing the total. Child development facilities that receive funds from OSSI must pay eligible lead teachers and assistant teachers in the following staff types in DELT salaries that meet or exceed the minimum salaries. Only teachers and assistant teachers will be included in the CDF payroll formula calculation. There are 4 staff types in DELT that qualify as an assistant teacher for the purposes of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program. You can see them here. They are an assistant teacher, a Montessori assistant teacher, a PKEEP assistant teacher, or an associate home caregiver. There are also 4 staff types in DELT that will qualify as a teacher for the purposes of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. They are listed here: a teacher, a Montessori teacher, an expanded home caregiver, and a home caregiver. These are the staff types that will be included in the payroll formula calculation, and these are the teachers that we will be looking at for compliance with the minimum salary requirements. The required minimum salary and corresponding wage supplement will be based on the highest credential or degree that an educator has, as documented, reviewed, and approved in DELT. So for lead teachers, to qualify for what we call the BA wage supplement, teachers must have a bachelor's degree or higher in early childhood education, or a bachelor's degree or higher in another field with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education. To qualify for the AA wage supplement, they must have an associate's degree in early childhood education or an associate's degree with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education. To qualify for the CDA wage supplement, they must have a CDA, a Child Development Associate credential, for 48 credit hours with greater than or equal to 15 hours in early childhood education. For assistant teachers, to qualify for the AA wage supplement, they must have an associate's degree or higher. To qualify for the CDA wage supplement, they must have a child development associate credential. And to qualify for the less than CDA wage supplement, the teacher would have less than a CDA. The wage supplement is the difference between the average salary and the minimum salary requirement for a teacher based on their role and credential. The average teacher salary is based on responses to the 2022 Child Care Provider Survey that hopefully many of you completed last year. The actual salaries paid to early childhood educators in your facility may be different than the average salary. This is a district-wide average, but the wage supplement will be the same amount for all child development facilities based on the role and credential of the teacher. Because we understand that some facilities may have staff who are paid below that average current salary, OSSI has added the fiscal year 24 supplement to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund to the CDF payroll funding formula to help providers who may pay less be able to meet those minimum salary requirements. Now, because the base award will be calculated based on information that is entered and approved in DELT, it's important to be mindful of provider deadlines for entering staff records in DELT prior to the award calculation. As I mentioned, formula awards will be recalculated each quarter. Providers must ensure that staff records in DELT are up to date and accurate so that all of the teachers and assistant teachers who should be included in the calculation are calculated at the wage supplement that they should have based on their highest credential. Providers who have completed agreements by that Q1 deadline, September 30th, must update staff records by October 31st. After that date, OSSI will calculate Q1 CDF payroll funding formula amounts for all providers. So here again on the slide, you can note the deadlines for updating DELT to ensure that the payroll funding formula has the correct calculation. Facility leaders who require assistance updating staff records or have questions about staff credentials should contact their assigned licensing specialist. I just want to note that in addition to these deadlines, OSSI licensing regulations require all child development facilities to maintain up-to-date staff records in DELT regardless of participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. So this is important to stay on top of. Now I want to move on to the next component of the CDF payroll funding formula. The administrative enhancement is 15% of the base award. It provides funds for increases in mandatory payroll taxes and other possible increased expenses that facilities may experience from participating in the program. Next, we have the equity adjustment. This component of the formula, as I mentioned, has been revised since OSSI first published the CDF payroll funding formula. The equity adjustment now equals up to 60% of the base award, and it's calculated based on the facility's subsidy enrollment as a share of licensed capacity. Previously, the equity adjustment was equal to up to 40% of the base award. This change increases the amount that each subsidy provider will be able to receive. The equity adjustment directs increased funding to child development facilities that serve families and communities with fewer economic resources. Facilities that do not participate in the child care subsidy program will not receive equity adjustments to their base award. And finally, the fiscal year 24 supplement. This is the new addition to the formula. OSSI is increasing fiscal year 24 awards for all facilities to support them in meeting minimum salary requirements in the first year of the program's implementation. The fiscal year 24 supplement is 30% of the sum of the base award, administrative enhancement, and the revised equity adjustment. So all facilities will receive an award that is at least 30% larger than what we had previously released. One more note about the CDF payroll formula calculation. As I mentioned, OSSI will run the formula quarterly. OSSI will not make adjustments to quarterly payment amounts based on changes in the number of teachers employed or their credentials that occur after the deadline for updating DELT for that quarter. Providers that experience changes in staffing after the quarter deadline should update staff records prior to the next quarterly deadline, and will see updates reflected in the following quarter's payment. Now I'm going to move on to another part of the provider agreement, overpayments and underpayments. Each quarter, providers will receive a pay statement that includes a list of the eligible educators in each facility who are included in the CDF payroll funding formula calculation. Providers will be able to view the award calculation and the amount. Providers must notify OSSI within 30 calendar days of receiving the payment statement if they believe there is an error in the calculated payment. Providers who believe there is an error must show documentation to prove that that payment calculation is inaccurate. Additionally, if the facility's quarterly payment differs from the payment statement, the provider must submit an error report to OSSI within 10 days of receiving the quarterly payment. Providers must report also to OSSI all overpayments, regardless of size. Overpayments will be recovered through deductions from future quarterly payments. If there are any underpayments, those will be added to the next quarterly payment. The agreement details the allowable uses of funds. We have shared these previously on other information sessions, but you can see here the CDF payroll funding formula awards can be used in these following ways: to meet the minimum salary requirements for lead and assistant teachers, as we've been discussing, to pay staff wages or compensation for additional early childhood educators and other child development facility employees, to pay costs of health benefits and other benefits for early childhood educators and for other child development facility employees, to pay administrative costs associated with implementing the salary requirements or with meeting requirements related to the pay equity fund generally. And finally, to pay direct operating expenses of the facility associated with providing care and early education services to children. Note that a provider that operates multiple facilities may not use funds to cover costs associated with facilities that are not participating in the fund, and may not use funds to cover costs associated with facilities that may be outside of the District of Columbia. Now, moving on to requirements related to staff wages and salaries. After receiving the first quarterly award, providers will be required to pay teachers and assistant teachers, again, as defined by the Pay Equity Fund, the minimum salary requirements by role and credential, or wages that meet or exceed those minimum salaries. Providers can use the annual salary figures for staff who are paid on a salary basis and the minimum hourly wage figures for staff who are paid on an hourly basis. Participating providers must meet the minimum salary requirements through hourly wages or annual salaries through a regular paycheck. In other words, these funds are not intended to be supplemental or bonus payments. You can go to the next slide, please. Providers will be required to upload payroll records and related documents in DELT on a quarterly basis in order to show compliance with those minimum salary and hourly wage requirements, which OSSI will monitor. The agreement also says that providers are required to adopt a salary schedule that outlines minimum and maximum salaries for lead and assistant teachers by credential. This salary schedule must also be uploaded to DELT. Please note that providers may choose to use the salary schedule that OSSI has published. It was published back in April, but they are not required to do so. On the next slide, you can see the example of OSSI's salary schedule. As I said, this is only an example and providers are not required to use this schedule. But you can see here as an example that in this schedule, the first step is equal to the minimum salary requirements, which providers must follow. Providers can choose whether to include steps that are tied to experience in the salary schedule. And if they do, they may choose how many steps to include. But that lowest salary for any role and credential combination must meet or exceed the minimum salaries that have been established by OSSI. The agreement also requires providers to provide every teacher and assistant teacher with a formal letter or contract stating their name, their staff type, where they're employed, the anticipated hours and schedule that they work, their annual salary or hourly wage, and any benefits that are provided. That contract or letter must be signed by the employee and the employer, and a copy of it must be maintained in the staff record in DELT. The letter or contract should be updated if there are any changes in the terms of employment or compensation. For each lead or assistant teacher covered by the fund, in addition to any other staff person who may have a salary who's paid in whole or part with CDF payroll funding formula funds, the facility must maintain up-to-date staff records in DELT. Those records must include the employee's base salary or wages, which again can be in an hourly or annual format, participation in health insurance coverage or other benefit programs, documentation of the employer's offer letter or employment contract that I just mentioned, and documentation of staff credentials as required by licensing. These records will be reviewed, updated, and submitted for approval by licensing staff by the quarterly deadline established by OSSI that we've shown on those slides. Now, in addition to staff records, we will require providers participating in the Pay Equity Fund to share enrollment and tuition data with us. Providers must provide quarterly a report on the facility's total enrollment by age of children and the number of enrollment vacancies. This data will be very important for OSSI to have a better understanding and be able to track total enrollment and vacancies across the district, allowing us to better target supply building investments and other supports for providers. We will also ask that providers provide to OSSI annually a schedule of tuitions and fees that are charged to tuition paying families. Again, here, we will help OSSI really have better data to understand what tuition trends are over time and across the district. It will also eliminate the need for OSSI to do a market rate survey. So we will have this information that we often are attempting to get through surveys. OSSI is really interested in being able to track whether this program, the Pay Equity Fund program, impacts what parents pay for childcare in the district, and any requirements on programs related to tuition or OSSI will not make any requirements on programs related to tuition or use this information to evaluate tuition charged by individual programs. It is really for our analysis to understand tuition across the district. Now, moving on, the provider agreement covers fiscal requirements of the program. Providers must maintain workers' compensation insurance for all employees. Every business in the district with employees is required to carry workers' compensation insurance. Providers will also be required to comply with the district's Living Wage Act of 2006, and they must sign the District of Columbia Living Wage Act of 2006 affirmation form to understand that they will comply with this act. This certification will be provided to OSSI annually. The Living Wage Act applies to programs that accept monies from the district generally and applies to all employees not otherwise exempt, not only those covered by the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, but all employees. Facilities that participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund must meet the minimum salary requirements for pay equity for eligible teachers and assistant teachers, and must meet the Living Wage Act requirement for other employees. The living wage currently is $17 an hour. Now, that is the same as the district minimum wage, but in the future, those amounts may be different. Providers must also comply with the district's Universal Paid Leave Amendment Act of 2016, which does require all employers to offer paid leave benefits to eligible employees and to pay a payroll tax to be able to fund those benefits that are offered in the district. Moving on to annual observations. OSSI is requiring that participating programs allow OSSI to conduct annual classroom observations and evaluations. This is a requirement that subsidy providers are already meeting because they participate in capital quality. For non-subsidy providers, this requirement may be new. We are not requiring participation in capital quality. We are just requiring the annual observation and evaluation. Having information on the quality of early childhood programs is really important, again, to enable OSSI to target quality improvement strategies and professional supports for providers. We will share with facilities the program level results of observations so that you also can have better data about classroom quality. And you may choose how you want to use that information. We will not assign a rating or other quality designation to a facility that is not participating in capital quality. We may, however, use the results of observations in aggregated reports that include information from all observed licensed child development facilities, but we will not share information that is specific to a child development facility. Sometimes we have independent researchers who are studying early learning in the district, and again, we share results of observations with them, but we will also prevent the disclosure of any information specific to a child development facility. Now, the next topic is records. It is really important that any records related to the program be maintained. This includes copies of employee contracts, offer letters, salary schedules, all the documents that we've talked about, and all the documents necessary for the agreement. And it's important to retain those for a period of no less than 5 years. Should there be an audit or any administrative or judicial proceedings related to the pay equity program, it's important that records be retained in order to see those and until the conclusion of such proceedings. And again, OSSI shall have the right to inspect and copy all records related to the program. Next slide. In the coming weeks, OSSI will outline in more detail the monitoring and auditing processes for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Providers are expected to cooperate fully with all monitoring and auditing processes. OSSI will monitor providers quarterly for compliance with the minimum salary requirements. This will happen through a review of payroll records and other documents. Each provider will be monitored. OSSI reserves the right as well to audit any child development facilities who we flag in DELP based on irregularities in staffing patterns. So for example, if a facility appears to have an unusually large number of staff employed relative to the children enrolled, we may take a closer look to ensure that those records are accurate. Next slide. The agreement states that providers are responsible for the payment of all taxes and fees incurred from any pay equity fund payments. As educators' salaries increase, mandatory employer payroll taxes will also increase. The provider is responsible for paying all employer taxes and ensuring appropriate employee tax withholding on salary payments to staff. If you have questions about any impacts related to taxes, We recommend consulting with an accountant or tax professional and advise any employees who may also have concerns to do the same. Now, many of these slides get into some legal terms that are standard in most district contracts. Indemnification is a legal term to ensure that parties are protected from legal liability in a contract. The agreement states that the district and its agents are protected and held harmless from any possible monetary liabilities that could occur as a result of actions taken by a provider related to the program. This is standard contracting language. Unrelated, the agreement also notes that the district's financial obligations to pay providers are contingent upon the availability of appropriated funds as approved by the district council and subject to associated statutes. Now, again, this is standard language in all district government contracts, including the subsidized child care provider agreement. It does not mean that OSSI anticipates running out of funding for this program. The Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund was created as a long-term funding mechanism, and OSSI intends to continue administering the program for the entirety of fiscal year 24 and into the future. The agreement will be in effect from the date that it is signed by OSSI's Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning until September 30th, 2024. So it's for the entirety of fiscal year 24. The agreement may be extended annually, provided that written notice is given by OSSI to providers. The agreement may not be extended more than 4 times from the original date. And OSSI will notify all providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund of agreement renewal or extension procedures at the appropriate time. So again, we will let you know as we're getting to the close of fiscal year 24 about the agreement process for fiscal year 25. Childcare providers that opt into the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will have the option to terminate their participation. And the agreement lays out the process through which you may do so. Of course, we hope that you won't choose to do that. But should a provider want to end participation in the fiscal year 24 Pay Equity Fund, they must report to OSSI prior to the 15th day of the first month of the quarter in which the provider intends to terminate the agreement. So again, you can see the quarterly deadlines for opting out. Providers who opt out by that date will not receive additional formula payments unless there are payments owed as corrections for past underpayments. Should a provider opt out, they must continue to pay eligible staff at least the required minimum salaries until the start of the following quarter. So in other words, the payments that have been received must be used for teacher salaries. You can see here in the example, a facility that receives funds for Q1 in December and decides to opt out in January must comply with the minimum salary requirements through March 2024. The district may also terminate this agreement for any reason effective upon receipt of written notice. The district is required to provide the provider a written notice of termination, specifying the reason for the termination and the effective date. OSSI reserves the right to monitor the provider's documentation of compliance during quarters in which the provider participated in the fund, even if a provider decides to opt out of the fund. The provider agreement may be modified, renewed, or extended in writing only. And if that happens, the parties must sign and date any modifications to the agreement. Should OSSI need to amend award payments, which again, we do not anticipate doing, should we need to, based on actions of the DC Council, OSSI will unilaterally modify the agreement for all providers. In the event of a reduction in funding, OSSI will provide guidance to child development facilities on adjustments to the minimum salary requirements. Again, I want to underscore here that this language related to potential reductions in funding is standard language. It does not indicate that OSSI anticipates a decline in funding for this program in fiscal year 24 or in the future. Now, this slide covers a couple of different topics. The first, the agreement lays out the process for resolving disputes, should there be any between providers and OSSI. The agreement talks through the process in which we will attempt to resolve any disputes informally, and if that's not possible, through written statements and appeal process that are noted in the agreement. The agreement also ensures that the district is not liable for any injury, claim, or loss to a person or property as a result of the performance of this agreement. And finally, here again, standard contract language, providers are being asked to name a representative to receive any outstanding payments in the event of incapacitation or death. Standard contracting language. Now, there is also a provision around the hiring of district residents. This provision in the agreement states that any newly created employee positions must comply with the District First Source Act, which requires at least 51% of all new jobs created as a result of a contract to be performed by residents of the District of Columbia. I want to explain this a little bit further. This is standard district contracting language. It is also included in the Child Care Subsidy Provider Agreement, so it is not new for subsidy providers. The requirement does not apply to existing staff, and it does not apply to filling vacancies in positions that existed prior to a facility's participation in the Pay Equity Fund. So you don't have a requirement on the teachers who you currently employ. If a teacher leaves and you are hiring a new teacher in a classroom, this does not apply. In general, we do not expect that child development facilities will be hiring new staff as a result of complying with the provider agreement, which is the only circumstance in which this 51% requirement would kick in. The provider agreement lays out issues around noncompliance. OSSI shall investigate all allegations of misconduct and noncompliance. Now, I want to mention here that the information on the slide differs slightly from the process for addressing noncompliance that is in the sample provider agreements that we've posted. So this has been revised, and you will see it in the updated language in the revised provider agreement. The process will be that providers receiving a notice of noncompliance will have an opportunity to correct that noncompliance in a time period designated by OSSI. Providers may also appeal a determination of noncompliance. Following 2 infractions of noncompliance, a provider may be identified publicly on My Child Care DC as being out of compliance with the program, with the minimum salary requirements. And following 3 infractions, a provider may be terminated from the program for a minimum of 1 year. Again, providers may appeal a determination of termination. Non-compliance and termination appeals will be reviewed by OSSI, and all reviews determinations will be final. The agreement goes on to clarify the actions OSSI can take in response to a provider's failure to comply with terms of the agreement. These include temporarily withholding payments, wholly or partly suspending or terminating the current agreement, not exercising option years, in other words, not renewing at OSSI's discretion the provider agreement. OSSI may recoup any overpayments based on audit findings, investigations, late termination, or calculation errors, and may take any other actions legally available. Any provider who obtains funds as a result of submitting falsified documents, information, or data shall be required to pay back those funds to the District of Columbia. Any provider who is confirmed to have violated the requirements of the agreement may be referred to OSSI Dell Licensing and Compliance Unit or to the District of Columbia's Office of the Attorney General for further action. OSSI shall disallow any costs or payments that OSSI determines were not expended in compliance with the agreement. So the use of funds that we covered earlier. OSSI may also disallow any costs if they are unable to verify whether they were expended in compliance with the agreement due to the provider's failure to retain or provide appropriate documentation. Providers will be required to return all disallowed costs or payments to the district. And finally, the very last section of the agreement addresses a couple of different topics. The agreement just is clear that it supersedes any and all prior agreements between the provider and the district regarding the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Again, this means the agreement that you are signing is the most updated and recent agreement. The agreement also makes clear that parties may not assign or transfer the agreement or any right or obligation of the agreement. That means, again, if a provider were to sell their facility to a new owner, the new owner will be required to enter into a new provider agreement. The pay equity agreement is non-transferable, just as a license for a child development facility is non-transferable. Finally, the agreement must be signed by OSSI and the child in order for the child development, the agreement must be signed by OSSI and the child development facility to be considered fully executed. So again, remembering that first quarter deadline, the agreement must be signed and fully executed by September 30th. That was a lot, and I'm sure there are questions. Thank you so much for bearing with us to ensure that everyone understands their obligations under the provider agreement. Before we get to Q&A, I'm going to talk about the waiver process that OSSI has recently announced for fiscal year 24. As I mentioned last week, OSSI announced changes to the Pay Equity Fund for fiscal year 24. We talked about the revisions to the payroll funding formula. In addition, OSSI is offering a waiver process for fiscal year 24. These changes are in direct response to feedback that we've received from facility leaders and early learning stakeholders about concerns about the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program this fiscal year. So we are really happy to be able to respond to those concerns and offer the enhanced payroll funding formula as well as the waiver process. So a little bit more about the waiver process. Facilities that are still unable, you can go to the next slide, please. Facilities that are unable to meet the minimum salary requirements, even with these increased award sizes, with all the increases with the fiscal year 24 supplement, facilities will be able to apply for a waiver of the minimum salary requirements. We will soon share information with child development facilities about how to apply for a waiver, as well as the specific criteria that a facility must meet to be granted a waiver, and the requirements that will be put in place once facilities receive waivers. Next slide, please. While we will be providing more details, it is important to know that facilities that request a waiver will be required to share financial information with OSSI that documents their inability to meet the minimum salary requirements without operating at an unsustainable budget deficit. Facilities will also still be expected to use funds they receive from the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund to increase pay for their staff. So in other words, even if a facility cannot raise salaries enough to meet the minimum salaries, they will be required to use those pay equity funds to raise salaries some amount. There will also be other program requirements. We are very glad to be able to provide this opportunity to providers who need it, but we do not intend to issue blanket waivers. We will issue waivers to providers who can demonstrate that the waiver is a financial necessity. Again, I look forward to sharing more information about this process in the coming weeks. And with that, I will turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, Hannah. Before moving into our Q&A, we do want to do a quick poll. to see what language everyone is attending this meeting in. So you'll now see a poll question on your screen. So please tell us what language you're attending the session in, and the options are English, Spanish, or Amharic. We'll give folks about a minute or so to respond. All right, we'll give folks another minute or so. All right, thank you everyone who answered our poll. We'll now move into our Q&A. I will start off the Q&A by saying that I've seen a few questions related to DIFS, which is the District Integrated Financial System. DIFS is operated by the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, that is OCFO. So if you have questions about DIFS or need support completing the application, we encourage you to reach out to OCFO. We will include their contact information in the chat. If you are having challenges getting in touch or completing the DIFS application, you can also email OSSI at ossi.ecepayequity@dc.gov. With that, I will head into our first question. And this is a question about funds and how they're paid. So does the increased hourly wage need to be paid per pay period, or is the facility allowed to provide it as a lump sum once funds are received?
Facilities are required to incorporate the pay equity fund into the regular paycheck or other means through which they pay their employees, and it cannot be given as a single lump sum.
Thank you. Another question, this is about requirements to participate. Can a facility participate if they do not enroll subsidy children?
Yes, however, a facility that does not enroll subsidy children will not receive the equity adjustment. They'll receive all the other components of the formula, but not the equity adjustment.
Another question related to the opt-in and agreement process. Will there be an opportunity to do a new agreement after the 4 quarters? So I guess that's at the end of fiscal year 24. Will there be a new agreement?
You want to answer that, Hannah?
Yes, the agreement is intended to cover fiscal year 24. We will share information with providers later on in the year about the opt-in and agreement process for fiscal year 25, but certainly anticipate that continuing.
Another question, they said, just for clarification, facilities joining in the 1st quarter, do they start paying the fiscal year 24 minimum salaries on October 1st, or when after they receive funding from OSSI?
Facilities may choose when to implement the increased salaries. However, OSSI will not require facilities to meet those minimum salary requirements until after receiving the 1st quarterly payment. So if you opt in at the beginning and receive the first payment in December, you would be required to raise salaries following that payment.
See, a question about the agreement. Does a provider create the agreement based on the list provided? I think this question gets at more of how does the agreement process actually happen? Maybe Hannah or Sarah, you can speak more to that.
I can speak to that. Childcare providers do not need to create the agreement. OSSI has created an agreement. That agreement language will be standard for all child development facility providers. That is very similar to the way that our subsidy agreement process works. A sample copy of the agreement is currently available on the OSSI website. That is, again, a standard agreement for this program. It is not something that we are in a position to negotiate or change for individual child development facilities. You will need to either choose to accept the agreement or not participate in the program, essentially. The difference in the agreement is that if you are a program that participates in the child care subsidy program, the agreement is actually shared as an addendum to your subsidy agreement renewal. That is because, as someone has mentioned in the comments, many of the documents and information required to renew your subsidy agreement are also required for pay equity. So we are combining those processes for subsidy programs so that you only need to submit some of those documents and information once rather than completing duplicative requirements. If you are not a subsidy provider, you will not have provided that information to OSSI. So we will ask you to complete an agreement and provide that documentation to us at the time you do so, or with your application. And then for subsidy providers, there are some things that we are asking that are not included in the subsidy agreement or that go deeper on certain topics related to staff pay than the information you provide for the subsidy agreement. And so there will be some additional information that subsidy providers will need to provide for this program. But our goal, as much as possible, is to avoid duplication and use the information that you're already providing us.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question we have is about the longevity of the program. Will this program be for just fiscal year 2024, or will it continue on after that?
Appreciate that question. I know there is some language in the agreement that may make people wonder. That is standard language that is in all DC government contracts, because all commitments we make in DC government are contingent on future availability of government fundings and potential changes in legislation, which are made by the DC Council. However, under the legislation that is currently in place that created the fund, we do not expect the fund to end at the end of fiscal year 24, and we expect it to continue to be funded and OSSI to continue to implement it. If at any time that changes, which would require council action, we will notify child development facility providers as soon as possible. But again, that is not something we foresee at this point in time. It is something that would be a decision that would need to be made by the DC Council and not by OSSI.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing a question here related to the opt-in process. Sounds like this is probably a non-subsidy provider completing the application. And they are asking, can we submit the application to apply for the program in doubt if we have not yet received an approval notification for diffs?
I'm going to ask you to reach out individually to the OSSI ECE Pay Equity Support line, because they can help you look at sort of what the options for information you may be able to provide are, or potentially help with following up with a CFO. Those kinds of questions are things we better deal with at an individual level than with a blanket statement on this call.
Thank you. Another question about how the agreement is received. So this person is asking, where do we accept the agreement?
That is a great question. So we will use Adobe Sign. I may not be saying the name exactly right. It is the same program that we use for our participants in our childcare subsidy program to sign agreements. If you're a program that participates in the child care subsidy program, you will actually receive the pay equity agreement as an addendum at the same time as you receive your fiscal year 24 SARA agreement to sign, and you'll sign it through that exact same process, the same way as our level 2 providers currently sign the level 2 provider addendum, if you're familiar with that process. If you are not participating in subsidy, you will receive essentially an automated email from Adobe. We'll send an email out to everyone in advance that says, look for this, please, in your inbox. Here's where it will come from so that you know what you're getting when you get it. But it will happen electronically through your email, through Adobe, and then you will get back the fully executed copy after I sign it, that will come to you through the same mechanism.
I just want to clarify for folks that the opt-in deadline is this Friday. So while we have, there's not an agreement to look for now, there is not a place to sign the agreement, but what you really do need to do right now is to make sure that you opt in by that 5 p.m. Friday deadline so that we can then make sure that you receive the agreement.
Thank you, Sarah and Hannah. Another question.
It works in is that you opt in, then you'll get the agreement, then you need to return the agreement to us by September 30th.
Our next question, most of the data that's being requested, subsidy providers have already shared as part of the fiscal year 24 subsidy agreement that they submitted. Will subsidy providers need to submit everything again as part of the monitoring process that was described?
So I think I addressed some of this in the response to the question about the agreements. We are not requiring folks to submit the same things for the pay equity application process that they're submitting for the subsidy monitoring process. There will be a requirement for folks, once you are in the program, to provide some information to OSSI on a quarterly basis, including documentation of staff compensation. So that is a little bit different than what you're required to provide for the subsidy program. And that is something that you will need to provide on a quarterly basis.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing a question here about the minimum salary an educator would be eligible for. And it says, what if a staff has a bachelor's in another field like psychology, or even a master's degree, but has been working in a facility for 2 years or more? What payment will they qualify for? In this type of scenario, I encourage folks to look at a recent guide that OSSI published that helps break down the minimum salary an educator is eligible to receive, which is based on their staff type and highest credential. If you still have remaining questions, I would encourage you to email ossi.ece.payequity@dc.gov. We do get a good number of questions about certain scenarios based on staff type and credential. Some more questions are for fiscal year 24, and this is a question about eligibility. Are directors eligible for minimum salaries? Is there a minimum salary for someone in the director's staff type?
Do you want to take that, Hannah? I can.
Go ahead.
Okay. So for fiscal year 24, the pay equity program requires minimum salaries only for individuals who meet the definition of teachers and assistant teachers, which, as a reminder, also includes home providers, expanded home providers, associate home caregivers, and a few other staff types Hannah mentioned. So the requirement to pay a minimum salary does not apply to directors if a facility opts into the fund. That said, facilities are receiving money, and as long as they are meeting the minimum salaries for their staff, if they have sufficient funds, they may use some of those funds to increase pay for other staff. They cannot do that if they're not meeting the minimum salaries for the covered staff. But if they have money left over after meeting minimum salaries for covered staff, which we hope some facilities will now as a result of the changes that have been made to the formula, then they could use those funds to increase pay for other staff if that's what they wish to do.
Another question about the opt-in process. So it says, is opting in dealt, so this would be for a non-subsidy provider. If a non-subsidy provider has completed the opt-in process in dealt and everything was completed except the diffs registration, are we good to go? I would say to reach out to the aussie.ece pay equity at dc.gov inbox. I will flag that applications must be complete by 5 p.m. on September 15th. So that includes all the required supporting documentation that is outlined in the guides that we have provided. Another question.
If people are having difficulties obtaining particular information or are unclear about your status, please reach out to us before that deadline if that is a challenge you're experiencing, and let us know about it. If you reach out to us after the fact and tell us you had a problem after the deadline, we will not be able to help you, but it is possible if you reach out before the deadline that we may be able to do something to help you address the situation. So please do that.
Thank you, Sarah. And this leads into our next question. Well, if a provider is not able to complete all the documentation by September 15th, would we not be eligible to opt in at this time?
And again, I think we need to understand what your individual situation is and the barrier that you're encountering. We have been encouraging folks to move forward with the opt-in process because some of the pieces may take you some time to assemble all the materials or do your registration in the district integrated financial system. However, if you're encountering an obstacle, go ahead and reach out to us rather than making assumptions about whether that will prevent you from participating or not. And we'll work with folks on a case-by-case basis. It really will depend on what the documentation you're not able to provide is and other potential aspects of the situation. So please reach out.
Thank you. Another question that we have, and I think we addressed this, but it's always good to share again. When will providers who have submitted an application or completed the opt-in process receive the agreement to execute?
Right now, our expectation is that you will receive the agreement shortly after September 15th and in advance of September 30th so that you will have some time to review and complete it. If, for example, we have a large number of programs that are coming in right at 5 p.m. on the 15th, that could delay slightly the timing of getting the agreements out. So I won't commit to a specific date, but the 15th is the deadline for you to indicate interest. The reason there's basically 2 weeks between that and the deadline to complete the agreement is so that we have time to send out the agreements, you have time to review them, and then to get them back to us.
Thank you. Another question, we mentioned this a bit ago, but I think this is always a good one to reiterate. When are facilities required to start implementing the minimum salaries if they are participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund?
So the requirement to implement the minimum salaries will be in effect after a facility receives the first quarterly payment, whenever they opt in. If they opt in Q1 and receive the Q1 payment, they will need to raise those salaries to comply with the minimum requirements following receipt of that first payment. It is up to the facility how they implement those salaries. So some facilities, if they have the resources, may choose to raise salaries sooner, but OSSI will not monitor for the increased salaries until after a facility has received that first award.
Got it. All right, another question, and this one is related to the hiring of district residents. And I know we've been seeing this question a bit. But the provider agreement and the provider agreement addendum include a provision on the hiring of district residents. So if my facility completes the agreement, will I have to ensure that 51% of any new hires in my facility are district residents?
So the answer is no. The requirement related to hiring district residents applies to any hires that are made as a result of the agreement. So in other words, by signing this agreement, if you were to hire staff to meet the agreement, we don't anticipate that facilities will actually hire staff as a result of the provider agreement. The requirement to hire a majority of district residents does not apply to your current staff, to your current employees. It does not apply to vacancies that may come about by a teacher leaving. So again, this is standard contracting language in the District of Columbia, and it is certainly important for anyone who is hired as a result of the agreement, but it is not applicable to the child development facilities staff and overall staffing. And just to say again, many of these legal requirements are in place in the subsidy agreement as well as the pay equity fund provider agreement. So this is a requirement that has been in place for subsidy providers for a while. And again, it does not apply to all of your employees of your facility.
Thank you, Hannah. Another question related to the agreement, and this is about classroom observation. So can you speak a little bit more to why classroom observations are included as part of the agreement?
Yes, I'll speak to this. So the district has a strong interest in understanding the quality of early learning experiences that children are experiencing in child development settings across the district. And we believe that if we are providing child development facilities with funding, we should be finding out information about the quality of services that are provided. For the purposes of this program, we will be conducting observations, but we will not be using the data from those observations to do any kind of evaluation or assessment of individual programs unless the programs are already participating in capital quality. If you're not participating in capital quality, we will collect that information so that we can use it for district-wide tracking of trends, levels related to quality on the observation tools, but we will not use it to evaluate the quality of individual programs or to assign ratings to programs. We will share any information that's collected about your program back with you because it's information about you. You have a right to know about it. However, there's no expectation or requirement for how you use that data. You may determine how you want to use that data in your program. And we do use the data. We already receive this information for capital quality participating programs, and we use it to inform investments that OSSI makes in supporting the early learning workforce and in supporting quality. So things like what kind of professional development do we provide to early childhood educators? What do we provide more of in our professional development system? Earlier this year, we used some of our COVID relief funds to make some investments in small facilities enhancements in some facilities. And that was also informed by data that we had seen through the early childhood environmental rating scale and the family child care observation scale ratings in the past, that we knew that there were areas where programs could benefit from that kind of funding. So that's the kind of things we use this information for. It's not our intention to use this to penalize individual programs. It's not our intention to tie specific observation data to sort of future requirements for participation in this fund. This is really about the district has a desire to improve quality for all children across the district and to support our programs and workforce well. And this data helps us as OSSI do that better.
Thank you. I'm seeing a question here, and I know that we have some home and expanded home providers on tonight's call, so I think this will be a good one to address. If I am a home provider, do I need to provide payroll records to show that I pay myself the minimum salary?
Yes, that is a great question. And so I will unpack this a little bit. The answer is actually no. Child development home and expanded home providers are business owners, and we know that as such. You may take your compensation in the form of salary, or you may take it in a different form. It is the intent of the fund to increase take-home compensation for child development home and expanded home providers, but not to require that you take that compensation in a specific way. The funding formula awards that are distributed to participating child development homes and expanded homes will include a wage supplement for the home or expanded home provider based on the teacher wage supplement that aligns with the highest credential the home or expanded home provider currently has, as listed in DELT. Homes or expanded homes that employ eligible early childhood educators other than the business owner / home expanded home provider will need to provide documentation demonstrating that their employees are paid at least the minimum salary or wages associated with their staff type and highest credential as listed in DELT. So if you have associate home caregivers that work in your program, then you would need to provide documentation of the salary paid to them, but that documentation does not need to specifically address the salary of the home or expanded home provider as registered with OSSI. Homes or expanded homes that are unable to meet the minimum salary requirements for all your eligible employees without incurring unsustainable budget deficits will also be able to apply for a waiver. We do really encourage child development homes and expanded homes to consider participating in the Shared Service Business Alliance to receive technical assistance and support around budgeting for how you will use early childhood educator pay equity funds, as well as support around how to look at both these funds and other revenue sources to maximize your income or increase what you're able to pay your staff. That is part of the reason that we created the Shared Service Business Alliance even before this program was in place, because we want to be increasing the take-home pay that our home and expanded home providers are able to earn and pay their staff. And so we do encourage people to look at the Shared Service Business Alliance for this program and more generally.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think we have time for one more question. And this, I think, Hannah, is a question for you related to the formula. So it says, will staff disbursements, so I think this is the CDF payroll funding formula award, be based on full-time employees regardless of actual staff scheduling? So what are the actual inputs in terms of staff that will go into the formula?
It's a great question. Currently, the wage supplement is based on the staffing type of the educator and the highest credential that they hold. It is the same for all educators in that role and with that credential. We recognize that facilities may have staff who work less than full-time year-round, may pay them on an hourly basis or a salary over a shorter period of time. So those minimum salary requirements are intended for full-time year-round workers. If a facility, we also have corresponding hourly minimum wage requirements, not the minimum wage for all employers in the district, but minimum wage for the pay equity program. If you have employees who work part-time, you do not have to put them on an annual salary, and you may use those hourly minimum wage requirements to determine their pay. But at the present time, the wage supplements will be the same, will be solely based on the educator's role and credential.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Sarah. This will wrap up our Q&A. I will encourage everyone, if you did not have your question answered or have outstanding questions, please do email us at ossi.ece.payequity@dc.gov, and our team will get back to you. And with all of that, I want to thank everyone who has joined tonight's information session. For more information on the fiscal year 24 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, please do visit the OSSI website. You can find the link there on your screen. I also encourage everyone to review the FAQ for child development facility leaders. This FAQ was just updated last week and has good information on the increased CDF payroll funding formula, as well as the announced waiver process. And then finally, as I mentioned just a moment ago, for questions, please do reach out to us. You can find us at ossi.ecepayequity@dc.gov. And so thank you again for everyone who joined us tonight. A recording of this session will be posted on the OSSI website in the coming days. I will also flag that we have another session planned for Thursday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. It will be similar to this session, but we encourage you to attend if you have any outstanding questions. Thank you.
Thank you.